One of the least talked about yet very critical combat areas in World War II was the China, Burma, India, or CBI, theater of operations. What was the strategic mission for the Army in the CBI? What were the key operations that achieved tactical success for the Army? And how did iconic units like the Flying Tigers and Merrill's Marauders capture the imagination and admiration of Americans for decades? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're discussing the China, Burma, India theater of operations during World War II. And joining me for this discussion is historian Dr. Eric Setzekorn. Welcome, Eric.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, and welcome back to the Center of Military History. You've been gone for a little while. And we'll talk about that now as I give a little bit of background on who you are. So Dr. Eric Setzekorn is a historian and author of 3 books: The Rise and Fall of an Officer Corps, The Republic of China Military, 1942 to 1955, Arming East Asia, Deterring China in the Early Cold War, and Uncertain Allies, General Joseph Stilwell and the China, Burma, India Theater. This is from the Naval Institute Press in 2024. His next book, Island Bastion, A Military History of Taiwan from 1949 to 2024, is currently under contract and should be released in 2026. After service in the U.S. Army and the intelligence community, he received his Ph.D. from George Washington University in 2014. He has published over 24 academic articles and publications, such as Parameters, the Journal of American East Asian Relations, and the Journal of Military and Strategic Studies. He is an employee currently of the U.S. federal government and also an adjunct faculty member at George Mason University and the University of Maryland Global Campus. And kind of what I alluded to earlier, you used to work here at the Center of Military History also.
Yes, I did. For many years, wonderful people, great programs here. And it's wonderful to be back, just for a day, that is.
That's right. Good. Good to see familiar faces always. And before we get into the questions, was there anything else that you wanted to add?
I just wanted to briefly mention a disclaimer that I am an employee of the U.S. federal government, which means that any views expressed here today on this podcast are my personal views and not those of any agency or department.
All right. Great. Good. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So now we've been doing this World War II series, but China, Burma, India, it's something that's often overlooked by a lot of people. In fact, I know when I've mentioned it to people, they didn't really understand much about it unless I said the Flying Tigers or Merrill's Marauders. But there's so much more to it than that. So can you kind of set the scene for us here? Give me a bit of a strategic setting for the United States in the CBI area of operations. I'd like how and when did America and specifically the U.S. Army and Army Air Forces get involved in that area, and what were our objectives?
Sure. I think there's so many different lessons we can draw from the CBI theater, but it is, I think one of the reasons it's not as well known is it is a frustrating theater in that it doesn't fit into sort of neat and tidy boxes of tactical or strategic operations because there's so much going on. And I think if we look at the theater as a whole, we'd say it's incredibly vast, but also diverse because there's a desire. The theater really comes about late 1941, after Pearl Harbor. How is the U.S. going to get involved in the war to fight Japan? Okay, there's obviously a fight in the Pacific, which was mainly dominated by the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. But China, that is the Republic of China, nominal leader Chiang Kai-shek, although he doesn't have total control over the country. There's this other guy, Mao Zedong, who also controls some forces, communists. One thought is to help Chiang Kai-shek, help the Chinese, who are engaged. They had been engaged with Japan since 1937. and improve their war effort. So how can the United States do that? Well, the decision was made in early 1942 to send a senior military leader, General Stilwell, Joseph Stilwell, to CBI theater, and that encompasses just the theater sort of geography. This is a period where there's still British colonial rule in India. So India includes not only India, but Pakistan, Bangladesh, the British control Burma. So all the way from, think of Karachi, Pakistan, basically continental Asia, all the way to Shanghai.
Wow.
That's the CBI theater.
That's huge.
And it's a huge area, and it's very, you can imagine, British-controlled India. You have the jungles of Burma. You have Southeast Asia, which wasn't really a primary area for the theater, but then also China, which has its own issues and challenges. The goal for the U.S. Army particularly had always been, how can we help the Chinese improve their military? Their military needed equipment, it needed training, it needed integration into a larger allied war effort. But that became a real challenge when the Japanese occupied first Singapore, take Singapore in early 1942, and then invaded Burma. Because if the Japanese control China's east coast, how do you get weapons, goods, anything into China? You ship it to Burma, and then you take it overland into China.
Right.
Well, that's then cut. So for General Stilwell in the U.S. Army, you now have this challenge of, all right, here's what we want to do. We want to get rifles and artillery into the Chinese. Well, we're going to have to fly it over both the jungles and then portions of the Himalaya, the hump air route into China. So for a long time, there's really the only game that's actually game in town fighting, so to speak, is Claire Chennault's The Flying Tigers, who had been formed before really the outbreak of war as the American Volunteer Group. They're brought into the U.S. military as Air Force personnel. Not always a happy marriage, but...
it wasn't, really.
Because... they had a rather freewheeling way of doing things, being part of the U.S. military again. A lot of interesting stories. But for U.S. Army leaders, that's always, air power is great, but we need to have some sort of, again, ground forces. But the CBI theater, I think one of the reasons it's not as well known, most U.S. Army forces are not combat troops. Stilwell always says, from 1941 all the way until he's relieved in 1944, give me 3 divisions. Give me an Army Corps.
Oh, wow.
And let me show you what I can do. He gets basically about 3,000 light infantry, Merrill's Marauders. Most of the troops are service troops, so construction forces, logistics troops, air transport troops to fly the planes. So the U.S. has a large presence, has a large role, but oftentimes it's not at sort of the tip of the spear, so to speak, which is another reason why CBI is maybe overlooked a little bit in post-war historiography.
Right, and then you had the British who, I guess, were pushed out of Burma, and so now they're in India, right? So what was the relationship between the U.S. forces and the British forces, or did it come under a single command over there?
Well, that is... I think it depends on who you ask.
Oh, okay.
That throughout the war, there's a real challenge because you're absolutely right. The British are pushed out of Malay. I mean, this is the British Empire really at a huge extent before the war. They control Malaysia, Singapore, Burma, all the way through what we think of as Bangladesh, India, Pakistan. The Dutch are in the East Indies. So these are huge colonial empires. So what is Britain's primary goal? Get their empire back.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's, for the United States, that's always kind of a tricky thing. We're fighting to fight the Japanese, particularly the U.S. Army is, hey, we got to take on Japanese divisions, defeat them, win the war. The British have sort of a longer-term view. We have our standing in Southeast Asia. And to be fair with the Chinese, too. Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese have been at war with Japan since 1937. This is, 1941 is halfway through their war.
Right, it's basically 42 by the time we really get involved, right?
Yeah. So it's another challenge because Chiang Kai-shek has his goals. He wants to come out of this war as the undisputed leader of China, preferably with a large, well-trained army. Does that mean he's always the most eager to go fight the Japanese, or would he want to carefully maintain his forces? So it's a tricky situation where the U.S. Army, particularly Stilwell, is kind of forced to beg, borrow, steal support, do a little bit of schmoozing, do a little bit of negotiating. And most Army officers, that's not really what they're brought up to do. They're brought up to say, I have an objective.
He's virtually a diplomat in a way over there.
In a lot of ways. Yeah. And that's frustrating. It's time consuming. And oftentimes it's, especially for the U.S. Army, it always feels like, boy, if we could just get more support, we could go out there and we could win this war.
So his at least his initial operations and maybe later on, were they all like just American-based operations, or were they working with the British and other allies in the area?
When he first gets there, he has almost no U.S. troops, no U.S. forces. So it is all liaison work. Because another reason it's so frustrating, so for example, the Japanese are going to invade Burma, which they do successfthis. The Chinese send some troops in, but they say, we don't really want them commanded by the British, right? Because we have these, the British, they have this sort of colonial mentality. Right. Maybe Stilwell will kind of take control. So that's one way he acts as an intermediary. But on the other hand, if you have your soldiers, are you going to give real control to a foreign military officer? Right. I think most Americans would have an issue with that. Yeah. So there's always this, we'll give you some influence to command our forces, but Chinese troops that are even nominally under Stilwell's command always know they can kind of, they can reach back to Chiang Kai-shek and say, hey boss, you okay with this order Stilwell just gave?
Right.
Maybe yes, maybe no. So it's lines of authority that in a military are generally up and down. Here are up and down, but also side to side, and all over the place.
All right, so let's move forward then into the actual tactical operations that Stilwell started launching. Can you describe what some of these are?
Yeah, I think one of the things Stilwell's faced with is that since he doesn't have U.S. troops, what's he going to do? And he quickly learns that he's going to have to beg, borrow, steal some of these Chinese troops, add, kind of like a chef, you're adding some flavor, some spices, adding U.S. air support, adding U.S. logistics support, adding U.S. training, but the actual, the riflemen in these units are Chinese. So there's 2 Chinese divisions that he has that have fled into India, and he starts training them. He's very fortunate. One of the Chinese division commanders is a WMI graduate.
Wow.
So speaks good English, a guy named Sun Li Jen. And he's able to put these troops, it takes a while. It takes really about a year and a half. Imagine taking soldiers they've never graduated any school, let alone like 8th grade or high school. They might be illiterate, training them to operate with U.S. Army weapons, machine guns, artillery. But he's able to forge them into a force. And he does get a little bit of support. Merrill's Marauders is the name you sometimes hear, which is a light infantry group. Originally about 2,000, 3,000. The numbers fluctuate quite a bit because the unit during the course of the war has several different iterations. But they will act as kind of a light infantry force that can help out, engage the Chinese. Stilwell's also able to gather a few tanks, some light tanks. So Sherman tanks, that's what you need to fight the Germans or whatnot. But in Burma, for example, the smaller, the Stuart tanks, the M3 tanks are just fine. So he kind of cobbles together this force, and by the beginning of 1944, really, the end of 43, they're able to drive down from north to south in northern Burma, trying to open this road again. But the challenge is...
And this road...
the Burma Road.
The Burma Road, right. Is this the one that went across the hump?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is the idea that if we can open this road, we can start using trucks instead of airplanes to haul things to China. But it's a slow process. I mean, you can imagine you're fighting in Burma. There's dense jungle. If there are no roads, so if you want to build a road forward, you got to build it as you go. You could be airdrop some supplies, but it's hard. It's slow going. Japanese, very tenacious defenders. I mean, that was seen throughout the war. That whether at Pacific Islands, they just don't quit. They don't surrender. So it's a slow process. It's a messy process. I would say the United States Army is effective, but it is never as quick as people would like. U.S. Army commanders would like. Merrill's Marauders, a source of frustration. One example, they're the only U.S. ground forces. So to maintain sort of American prestige during this campaign, they're forced to stay in the line, so to speak. Well, when you're in the jungle, that means you're getting diseases, you're getting fatigue. So they are just decimated as a unit by things like dysentery, scrub typhus. I mean, you can imagine.
Yeah, I think most of the casualties were disease related, not combat related.
Yeah, and if you look at the accounts, I mean, there's more discussion of leeches than there are of Japanese, because it's just such a brutal environment. Yeah. But if you have to sort of keep up the U.S. flag, so to speak, it could be very frustrating for Merrill. Merrill, an interesting guy, he has 2 heart attacks during the campaign.
Oh, wow.
So you can get an indication of how stressful and difficult this was for whether you're a rifleman in the jungle or even a colonel or general.
And with all of these actions, the Merrill's Marauders, who I think originally they were called Operation Galahad, is that right? Or was the unit called Galahad?
It goes through a couple iterations.
Oh, okay.
Galahad, later in the war, they kind of replace a lot of the personnel because the personnel are medically, by that point, invalid. They can't serve as combat troops anymore. And then Galahad, there's Galahad, and then there's New Galahad.
Oh, okay.
So I'll leave that for the lineage and honors folks you have here at CMH.
But what was the for their missions, the Merrill's Marauders, we'll just call them, what was the impact of what they were doing?
They did a really interesting job in that. So if you're working with the Chinese, you have 2 Chinese divisions, infantry divisions. They have heavy weapons. They have artillery. They move forward and engage the Japanese. And Stilwell says, Merrill's Marauders, you guys are light infantry. I'm going to send you, what does every Army officer learn in school? Fire maneuver. Oh, yeah. I'm gonna pin you, and then I'm going to send a force around your flank. Right. So the Merrill's Marauders have a very fascinating role. They're light, so they can move. The flip side of that is when they get there, they don't have anything really heavier than a mortar or a light machine gun. So they move around the Japanese flanks. You can imagine going 30, 40 miles through the jungle, hacking out a trail, trying to get around the Japanese position to either attack them from the rear or the side or force them to withdraw. Very physically demanding, very tactically demanding, because this is a period when there's no GPS, there's no satellite radio. Right. So you better hope you've got someone good reading the compass. Radio communication, very difficult. It's incredibly stressful for the leaders of that force, for Merrill's Marauders. But they're able to do this in a number of different, in particular, 3 flanking maneuvers, and really force the Japanese back. So an interesting collaboration between Chinese forces, American forces, trying to make something out of really a potpourri, hodgepodge of different elements.
And then at the same time, you mentioned earlier the Flying Tigers were there. What was their role in all this?
So the Flying Tigers, Claire Chennault, he is I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this. He's a wonderful pitch man. So Franklin Roosevelt is completely enamored of the Flying Tigers. And, Chennault, he's a wonderful briefer, and he kind of has this, grizzled face. My flyers, my heroic airmen can defeat the Japanese Empire by, he would argue, attacking shipping lanes. So during this time, the Flying Tigers are flying out of airfields in East China. And they do a really, I think, they achieve a lot for the resources. Imagine, I just say that because imagine this. You have a bomb you want to drop on a Japanese ship outside of Shanghai. That bomb has got to be flown over the Himalayas from India. It got to India because it took a ship from the United States East Coast to Karachi, and then from Karachi on a rail line. So it had touched a lot of hands, that one bomb you dropped. But he's able to do a lot of strikes on Japanese facilities, especially transport on the Yangtze River in the East China Sea. At the same time, it's not decisive because it's pretty small, right? It's a couple dozen airplanes is not gonna.
Oh yeah, so it wasn't a very large force.
It got larger as the war went on.
Okay.
I mean, that's one of the fascinating things, that by the end of the war, the CBI theater, if you're building bases, if you're building logistics infrastructure, if you're building roads, the peak of U.S. In China, for example, I think it was like 80,000 at the end of the war. 80,000 U.S. personnel in China. Yeah. Most of them support folks. But 42, 43, you're talking maybe 10, 15, 20. Wow. I mean, small numbers.
1,000 you're talking about.
Yeah. So it's definitely, there's constraints in 42, 43, and even into 44.
We also have Donovan in Detachment 101. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah. So one of the things that I love about this theater is that since it's not, if you're a West Point officer, if you're a hard charge and tank commander, you don't want to go to CBI. You want to go work for General Patton, General Bradley. So Stilwell, I think one of the things that's interesting about him, so he was a language guy. So he'd spent much of his career in the 20s, 30s, either in schools. He'd been assigned at the infantry school at Fort Benning, but he'd also been the military attaché in Beijing. So he spoke Chinese, which is one of the reasons he got the job in the CBI theater. He'd been an intelligence officer, and he picks up, I guess you'd call it whoever he can get his hands on. General Merrill's Marauders was a Japanese linguist attaché, not someone who's going to get a command in this. So regular Army, it picks him up. Detachment 101, he's able to pick up some of these. One of the main ones, General Pierce, later known during the My Lai Inquiry, General, three-star general in the 1970s, who's an ROTC graduate, right? So he's in the regular Army. He's probably not going on to bigger and better things, but
just happy to be fighting.
Sure, he's talented, he's sharp. It's like, boy, we'll put you in charge of this effort, which is, I think Stilwell's phrase is, I want to hear booms in the jungle, because he's like, I want you to go find indigenous personnel and give them explosives, give them weapons, and go, I want to hear booms in the jungle where you're blowing stuff up, you're sabotaging.
Right. So
bridges.
Detachment 101, in a way, it's kind of a precursor to what we look at today as Army Special Forces.
Yeah. I think
kind of like long-range training.
So the Japanese had, they generally, in Burma especially, did a lot of living off the land, which is they come into a village, and if they're hungry, they eat, and they take it from the villagers. So a lot of the people there had very bad experiences. And U.S. Army officers who are airdropped in, who are trained, I mean, of course they don't know local languages because this is, you could have someone with a different language 10 miles away in some of these Burmese areas. But they say, hey, look, do you want to join the war effort? And the war effort globally might mean nothing to these local people, but they might say, yeah, I don't like the Japanese. Give me some weapons. If a truck goes by, I can shoot at it. I can attack it. I can provide you with information. If you have downed airmen, I can return those airmen to you in return for, some supplies, some stuff like that. But it's also, we can think about that. You're right. Like it's sort of a special forces advise and assist. Do these troops, are they going to ever get them into an Army division of 18,000 people? No. But they collect information. They collect intelligence. They attrit Japanese forces. They inflict a lot of casualties.
And they pin down Japanese forces also. So forces that maybe the Japanese could have used at the front, they're having to keep in other locations.
Yeah. And it's, again, you make do with what you have. That's kind of the CBI motto in a nutshell is if you have folks that are the people you arm, are they going to march on Tokyo? No. But they sure as heck want to get the Japanese out of their valley. And if that works, you give them a few rifles, you give them a little C4 explosive, and let them do that, right? It's all adding up to hopefully something bigger.
Yeah, definitely. And then we talked about flying the hump, the Lido Road. Can we go a little bit more into details about that and kind of take us along the whole timeline of when that started and how that ended up?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating story because when Stilwell and his sort of forces, his detachment, are pushed out of Burma in early 1942. Many people say, okay, this is just, it's too hard. We're separated. We have India, we have China. That's not going to be a real theater of interest for the war. And Stilwell, by making all these deals, by negotiating, one of the big negotiations he made was with Army sort of road building forces. He says, this is an area just like the Alaskan Highway, Trans-Alaskan Highway, where the Army logistics engineers, combat engineers can make a name for themselves, and that's very attractive to the Army. It says, yes, we can do this. This is something where the U.S. Army has the skills, has the knowledge to build. Initially, the road is going to go south, sort of out of India, and then connect with the Burma Road. So the leader road, think of it as kind of a connecting highway. And hopefully, you'd then be able to drive a truck from India, where you can ship in supplies by rail, load on truck, send the truck off to China. But it's incredibly difficult. Imagine building a highway through the Amazon rainforest.
Yeah, wow.
And it's a fascinating part of the story is that many of those construction units are African American. This is when the Army is still segregated. And so that is really if you look at the accomplishments of many of those troops serving in, we mentioned disease.
Right.
Yeah. Imagine clearing 1 acre of land, how long that takes, how much effort, how many injuries, how much hard work was put into the war behind the front lines to make this possible. Wow. But it is successful by early 1945. The Japanese have been pushed far enough south in Burma that this road can connect, and you can have the first convoys of equipment driving into China.
And the purpose of that was to arm the Chinese?
Correct, yeah, because you can fly in rifles, you can fly in radios, but things that are bulky, heavy, fuel, artillery shells, ammunition, the goal is to make that more efficiently done by truck. The war kind of ends before really that highway. It's really getting built out by the end of the war. But that was the goal, and I think that was a real accomplishment of the theater.
Yeah, it's one of those popular things that I talked a little bit earlier in the intro about these things that capture the imagination of the American people for decades, and just looking back at that, the Lido Road, flying the hump, definitely captures the imagination.
Yeah, I think one of the wonderful things about this theater is that if you look at the like the Western Front in World War II, it's like, okay, it's France, it's Germany, fairly known things. You had you look at some of the memoirs of people who served in the CBI, and they're like, I was a pilot flying on the hump. We had an issue. I had to bail out. And they're like, I'm in the middle of nowhere. I have no idea who these people are. I have no idea what language they speak. So it was, I mean, repeatedly you just hear these stories and you're like, it's absolutely fascinating. Yeah. Difficult, dangerous. Right. Even for young men who are in their 20s, for example, the hump pilots, it was so stressful. They would fly from India. They'd fly a full load of supplies into China.
And the hump, the Himalayas, is the highest mountains in the world, I believe. Right?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is sort of a side branch. They're not flying over Everest directly, but it's still, you have winds, you have Japanese fighters. You have to, many of these planes were not pressurized. Right. Yeah. The manual sort of control, there's no, power assist. So if you're changing a rudder flap, you've got to be pretty strong. Oh, wow. Yeah. And so these pilots, they'd get to China, the flight surgeon would give them a shot of whiskey to steady their nerves, and then they'd fly back. But it was very high risk, very demanding. And many of these folks, one of the things I'm trying to highlight, CBI, it was catch as catch can. And so many of these folks have very limited training. Merrill's Marauders, you get off the ship in India, you're in combat in 60 days. If you're flying the hump, you went through a rushed wartime training program. You get shipped halfway around the world, and hey, congratulations, 21-year-old, you're flying this plane. It was, for what people had to work with, the amount of training, a tremendous accomplishment, because it was a lot of make do.
Yeah, and so let's pick up on that idea on making do. What are some of the biggest innovations that we saw by Army troops out there?
I think one of the things I'd really like to highlight is airdropping of supplies, because that was I think a hallmark of the campaign that became. We see this later in places like Vietnam, where you have the helicopter, of course. Yeah. But in World War II, you didn't see this in other theaters because you had line of supplies. But in CBI, many of these troops, you'd have a C-47 flying by. It's got an open door. It's not pressurized. Right. So it just has a guy, and they'd call him the kicker. right?
Oh, yeah.
You'd have a guy who's braced, and you'd have a couple bags in the door, and he would kick out his legs, and that would drop the supplies over. And there was definitely some trial and error. How do you pack things? How do you not hit people on the ground? Because that happened. It was you're making it up as you go along. But this is something where in 43, 44, 10 years before that, no one would have ever thought of, hey, you can supply a regiment in combat with airdrop supplies. That would have been like, what? Wow. Like, what are you talking about? But by 44, 45, you had fairly sizable numbers of troops where efficient process had been worked out. How do you coordinate? Evacuation. Helicopter evacuation was just starting at CBI at the end of the war. But before that, you would have these tiny planes fly into little landing strips hacked out of the jungle. They were so small, they would tie the plane's rear wheel to a tree. They would rev the engine as high as it could go, and then they would cut the line, and so the plane could kind of...
Oh, wow. Talk about innovation, right?
Yeah, it was all this stuff that was kind of made up as they went along, but they're trying to figure out, and I think there's a lot of lessons there for, after World War II, how many times has the United States fought in well-developed industrialized countries like Europe, France or Germany?
Right, yeah.
But the United States Army spent a lot of time in places like Vietnam, in places like Afghanistan, where logistics are a tremendous problem, where, the geography is... You don't have big roads. You don't have railheads. And I think a lot of these issues that were faced in CBI, they look awfully similar to later things.
Good lessons learned, yeah. I mean, not just in the time period, as you mentioned, and improving slowly, but the lessons they picked up later on, especially when it came to Vietnam.
Yeah, I think you highlighted earlier with the Special Operations Forces. I mean, what is a lot of the U.S. effort now? It's advise and assist. It's train, it's advisory efforts, it's coalition warfare. That was CBI. Yeah. That was really, I think, the mantra from start to finish was we are here alongside our allies and partners, British and Chinese.
When we talked about the Lido Road, you're talking about some of the environmental conditions that they had there. It reminded me also of the Burma Railway. The building of that mainly by the Japanese through the use of POWs. Any thoughts on that?
So I mean, I think the Japanese effort and really a lot of that railways in Thailand and in Burma going into because the goal is the reason they're building that railway is if you can ship something from Bangkok to Rangoon. You don't have to sail all the way down past Singapore and then all the way back up to Rangoon, where you might be vulnerable to Allied air attack. And I think both of those endeavors highlight, in some ways, the different philosophies of war. I mean, the Japanese, they're brutally using prisoners of war, many of them captured in Singapore, the British surrender of Singapore, versus the U.S. effort, you could almost say they want it to be a technological showpiece. For example, pipelines. Along the road Stilwell's forces are building, they have an enormous system of pipelines, they have maintenance depots, they have storage depots. It is just I don't know if a budget analyst would see it as a good investment. Right. But the British are just, one of the things the British keep saying, that won't work, won't work. You can't do that. And the American engineers are like, we're going to do it. You give us 6 months, and you come drive along our road. And it's a fascinating story of, I don't know if stubbornness is a virtue or, but it gets done. It takes years, but it's an incredible story.
Overall, what was the impact on the war effort, and then lessons learned? We briefly touched on them, but feel free to add any others. But what was the overall impact on the war effort? And what happened immediately after the war with Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek? Yeah.
That's a big question because Stilwell was relieved in late 1944. He's just had by that time, he's kind of worn out his welcome. Yeah. He's had too many disagreements. And that's just when, for the U.S. military, we're starting to get enough, U.S. Army is starting to get enough supplies into China. The goal all the way back in late 41, early 42, by late 44 or 45, it's starting to actually happen. So he's relieved, and Albert Wedemeyer, the theater is split in two. Okay. So Albert Wedemeyer takes over China. A guy named Dan Sultan sort of takes over the Burma, India section of the theater. So the theater gets split. By the end of the war, you're starting to see the goal actually being realized. That is, large amounts of supplies are coming into China, and you're starting to see a program of American advisory efforts where really about 30 Chinese divisions. The goal is 30 Chinese divisions can be fully outfitted with American-style equipment loads. That means, M1 Grands, 105 millimeter howitzers, American standard mortars. We'll get them supplied to make sure they can go out there and fight. That's still kind of in the process of happening. And
were they going to both Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, or was it just one or the other?
Just Chiang Kai-shek, because Mao Zedong at this point is kind of in the north of China, and that had always been the issue. And this leads into the post-war, is that the American effort, yes, you can say it's frustrating because when the war ends in August, if the war continued another year, I think it would have been radically different. You would have started having these U.S. forces really engage Japanese troops on the battlefield. But when the war ends in August 45, you do have semi-trained or somewhat trained Chinese forces now that Chiang Kai-shek can say, how shall I use these really good soldiers with all their really good equipment? One of the things is go seize Manchuria. Manchuria had been a Japanese colony before the war. Manchukuo, I guess I should say, had been a sort of puppet state. So they're airlifted up there. American C-47 planes are flying troops up there. But yes, in the post-war environment after 1945, there's a breakdown in sort of relations between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. George Marshall, former Chief of Staff of the Army, attempts to mediate, not successful. But eventually these U.S.-trained forces are defeated in the Chinese Civil War. So it's another aspect of that CBI. It's not a straightforward path. It's not a clear result, and that's another reason perhaps why CBI, it's like, if you're looking at it, you're kind of like, oh gosh, it's so messy.
Yeah, definitely. And so the lingering lessons learned here. What would you want to point out?
I'll give you two quotes, and this is something I came across doing research. So after the war, Fort Leavenworth, the bastion of Army knowledge, they brought together a lot of colonels and other senior leaders from CBI. And they basically said, we want you, intelligence officer, transportation officer, ordnance officer, get together, this 10 to 15 folks, and you write this report on what we should know about CBI. And there's two quotes that I think especially struck me. One was, and let me read it here, we were fighting the war with, they're talking about the Allies, saying that the British and the Chinese were fighting their war with definite political objectives in view, from which they never wavered. The United States was fighting simply to get the war over with at the earliest possible moment. So a major criticism in that report, the U.S. Army, field grade officers are saying the United States Army effort was fight Japanese, destroy Japanese military units, end war. Right. But national strategy is hopefully your military strategy is integrated into your national strategy. I think they made the argument that the U.S. Army's efforts were not integrated into a national strategy in the same way the British and the Chinese were. So that's one sort of lesson, why there wasn't a payoff, so to speak, for the U.S. Army. A second quote I'd like to highlight. Allied headquarters are ruled much more by political than by military considerations. All U.S. officers should be trained in such considerations. Because, for example, when Stilwell was relieved in 1944, head of China, Chiang Kai-shek, a very savvy political operator, sort of the leading British figure in India, a guy named Mountbatten, Lord Mountbatten, another savvy political officer. And if you put, it's that old saying, if you ever sit down in the poker game and you don't know who the sucker is, you're the sucker. If you're sitting down at that table to play poker and it's Mountbatten and Chiang Kai-shek and Stilwell, who's a dyed-in-the-wool Army. I just want to be out there fighting the good fight. Well, he's going to get taken. And that's, again, it's why do we fight military conflicts? To pursue a national political objective for the post-war world. And that was clearly something that the U.S. Army, institutions are like that, right? Institutions, we're here to fight, we're here to defeat the enemy. But that was always a challenge of integrating that into this confusing, contradictory, messy CBI theater.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for your insights today, all about the CBI theater. There's a lot there, and I know we just kind of briefly touched on some of the key points here. But before we close, now it's time for our segment called Hua Trivia. So do you have any piece of Army trivia that you can share about the China-Burma-India Theater of Operations?
I was looking for some trivia, and I didn't find a whole lot, but I did find a couple movies, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
One of them was from 1945, Objective Burma.
Right.
Errol Flynn.
Errol Flynn, yes.
Who you might know, Captain's Courageous.
Robin Hood, of course, yeah. Objective, it's a good movie.
Another interesting one from 1945, it's an Army information film called The Stilwell Road.
Oh.
Narrated by Ronald Reagan.
Oh, right.
Who, during World War II, was narrating Army information films.
Yeah.
There's another movie from the 1960s, Merrill's Marauders, with Jeff Chandler, who was a big star at the time. And from
That's a good movie too. Actually, I watched that recently.
Well, that's what I was thinking that for a theater that sometimes gets overlooked, it had a surprising amount of good movies. From 1959, there's Never So Few with Frank Sinatra as an Army captain, and I believe playing a corporal in his unit, Steve McQueen.
Oh wow!
So
in 59, or yeah. Wow, very cool.
Yeah, a couple, if I don't know if they're on Netflix or Amazon Prime or anything like that, but some interesting movies came out of the CBI theater. And movies that are not, how shall I say, glowingly positive. These are somewhat nuanced, gritty.
By the late 50s, you're starting to see the war movies going from more being, from glorious, and to being a little bit more critical, and especially about the individual soldier's life and story and stuff.
Yes, very much. The Frank Sinatra movie, Never So Few, is quite critical. As sort of, Stilwell has only been portrayed once in film that I know of, and that was Spielberg's movie 1941.
Oh gosh,
he's portrayed by Robert Stack.
Wow.
So no biography of him yet in the movies, that is.
And then just the trivia I'll bring up now. Familiar with Marion C. Cooper?
The name sounds familiar.
I think he worked with Stilwell, but he was a movie producer who fought in World War I. He was an aviator in World War I. I think he went out and worked, maybe with the Flying Tigers when the war broke out. So he gave up his movie career, working with John Wayne and Ford, fought in a CBI theater. And then, went back to making movies again later on with John Ford and John Wayne. But he also wrote and directed, based on an experience he had in Africa, King Kong. He was a one-star general, I think, in CBI.
One of the things about World War II is that it was such a totalizing war that, everybody was, whether you're in the home front, there's all these connections.
And one more, and I don't know all the details, but Julia Child.
Oh, yes.
Are you familiar with her connection to the
so
CBI?
she worked for the OSS. I believe she was in China from 43 or 44 for a year. That is, so she was in China proper, not back in sort of India.
Okay,
I don't know her specific role though.
All I know is she worked for OSS, and I believe she met her husband there. So
I think I've heard that as well. I don't know if there was cooking involved.
No, I don't think so. But anyway, thanks so much. Those are good bits of trivia and a great conversation about the CBI theater. So thanks so much, Eric, for being here and sharing your insights today about China-Burma-India Theater of Operations during World War II. And if anyone wants to learn more about the Army and the CBI and Pacific Theater during World War II, or learn more about Army history in general, then I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit us on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, X, and Instagram. And thank you all for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.